Good morning, everyone. Thank you to all of you for being with us this morning and to any members of the press for joining us for this important occasion. The International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines has now completed its independent monitoring and assessment of the May 9th, 2022 Philippine election. We have been actively monitoring the election with the Philippine Election 2022 International Observer Mission since March of this year. The overall main finding is that the election was not free and fair by international standards. In many ways, it was a classic guns, goons, and gold contest of inter-elite competition, but under a new backdrop of a successful massive social media campaign to rebrand the kleptocratic and criminal Marcos family brutal dictatorship as the golden age of Philippine politics. The return of the disgraced Marcos family to center stage in Philippine politics is consistent with the semi-feudal dynastic system that, that dominates political life in the country. Marcos Jr. is a two-time felon and a man who has personally profited from the theft of billions from the Filipino people and is now the president of the Philippines. Marcos Jr. now leads a government of dynastic family rule, a seeming dictatorship of the rich. The Philippine Election 2022 IOM was established as a response to investigate PH independent international investigation into human rights violations in the Philippines. The IOM has had observers on the ground since April 1st, and they have meticulously documented the campaign, the vote, and the aftermath in Central Luzon, National Capital Region, Southern Luzon, Central Visayas, Western Visayas, Eastern Visayas, and Mindanao. The IOM included members of national parliaments, trade unionists, church people, youth, educators, and human rights advocates. At various times, the IOM observers themselves were subjected to harassment and red tagging by the police and military. We are deeply indebted to all of those who worked for these past few months to make this IOM happen. And it's my pleasure now to turn to our lineup of speakers for this North American launch of the final IOM report. And my name is Reverend Sadie Stone, and I'm a member of the iChirp Global Council and also was a participant of the IOM this past year and recently returned as of Saturday, so just a few days ago. I would like to introduce our first speaker this morning, Professor Danny Aro, who is an associate professor at the Department of Journalism at the University of Philippines College of Mass Communications in Diliman, Quezon City. He is also a faculty affiliate of the Center for International Studies at UP Diliman and a special lecturer of the Department of Journalism, College of Communication at the Polytechnic University of the Philippines. And he's the editor of Media Asia, a peer-reviewed journal published by the Asian Media Information and Communication Center. He is a leading voice in Contradaya, a Philippine-based electoral monitoring organization. Thank you, Professor Danny, for being with us.
Thank you. Okay. So it's now my turn to speak, Reverend Sadie. Okay, yeah, I thought you're going to introduce the others. Anyway, so allow me to share my screen, and I promise to speak in just under 3 minutes. There's a lot to talk about with regard to election fraud, and at the outset, I would like to thank our friends from the international community, those who comprise the International Observer Mission, for coming up with additional empirical basis for the anomaly, euphemistically called the 2022 polls. Now, based on our own research, which dovetails with the findings of the International Observer Mission, there are various dimensions of fraud. So you have disinformation, mainly in the form of historical denialism and red tagging. There's also rampant vote buying, as well as harassment and intimidation of voters, and even certain party list groups and candidates identified with the opposition. There's also misuse and abuse of government resources, particularly by the incumbent officials. We've also seen cases of circumvention and mockery of the law particularly premature and illegal campaigning, as well as the wanton withdrawal and substitution of candidates, where certain political parties used placeholders so that the real candidates would be known much, much later, apparently to catch their enemies by surprise, or even the voters by surprise. Now, the bottom line with the election system right now is that there's still that domination of the rich and powerful, particularly by the political clans or the political dynasties, as well as big businesses. Part of the work of Contradaya has been to study the party list system. That's the mechanism in the House at the House of Representatives wherein at least 20% of the composition, or about 63 seats, exactly 63 seats at the House of Representatives, should be composed of those who are identified or who represent truly the marginalized and the underrepresented. However, the 177 party list groups who ran that ran in the elections are really not representative, and those who won, those at least 90% of the 63 seats actually came not from the marginalized and underrepresented, but those that were flagged by Contradaya. The fundamental problem with the automated election system right now is that there's the lack of transparency. There's a questionable partnership with Smartmatic, which is the one that administers the produces the vote counting machines, and it's the one that's overall in charge of the election, the automated aspect of the election, rather. So that has been our question ever since 2010, when automated election system started in the Philippines. Why is it that Smartmatic was the one who got the contract? So F2 Logistics, on the other hand, is owned by a major campaign donor of the incumbent president, Duterte. And we wonder why it's the one in charge of the handling, delivery, storage, and warehousing of election paraphernalia. So there's a lot of information that we cannot discuss at the moment due to the limited time, but you can go to the website of Contradaya to look at, for, for example, our end of day report, because May 9 was the date of the elections. So we came up with various information pertaining to the fraud and irregularities on that particular day. I want to draw your attention to, the preponderance of fake news. It has become so brazen that even resolutions coming purportedly from the Commission on Elections was faked. So that's an example of a resolution that's really fake news, because it says that certain party list groups and a senatorial candidate has been disqualified by the Commission on Elections, but it turns out to be not true. And we wonder why the COMELEC is not raising hell at this particular time, given the forgery that these fake news peddlers have done or have committed. So the final report, just like the International Observer Mission, Contradaya and our partner, Vote Report PH, also have our own findings. Again, these tend to dovetail with the findings as well of the IOM. The data are there. These are just the highlights. For more information, you can go to our website. Now, at this particular point, last 30 seconds, we just want to make sure that the message is clear, that there is reason to doubt the election results given the extent of fraud and other irregularities. The government, as particularly the Commission on Elections, would insist that the elections have been clean and honest since 2010. Actually, it's not true. It's all fake news because of the empirical data that we've been able to gather on the ground. So the lack of transparency as well raises doubts on the election process, and the domination of the rich and powerful should be repeatedly stressed. This is the main factor for the doubtful results of the elections, as I said. So just quickly, our call to action is to blacklist Smartmatic. There's a need to review the automated election system, to investigate the conduct as well of the May 9 elections. Amendments to the party list law could also be done, as well as the passage of the anti-dynasty law to somewhat curb the domination of the rich and powerful. Actually, there's a lot to say about it, but given the lack of time, I think I've overshot my allowed 3 minute time limit. I'm sorry about that. But nevertheless, we want to make sure that through this particular press conference, we're able to highlight the importance of the International Observer Mission, because we cannot stress enough the importance of international solidarity at this critical juncture of our country's history. So thank you again to our friends from the international community, and we hope that this particular partnership will be sustained, not just now, but in the succeeding election cycles in the Philippines. We cannot afford the domination of the rich and powerful, exacerbated by the fact that the son of the dictator will be serving as president for the next 6 years. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Danny, for being with us and for that comprehensive sharing and report. Also, as a reminder to anybody who is here with us, we will have a Q&A session following the presentation of our panelists. So if you have questions that are coming up for you, we have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to start putting any questions that are coming up for you there so that we can have those ready for our panelists to answer. I want to introduce our next speaker, Mac Miller, who was an IOM participant from the United States. Mac is a member of ICHIRP and a New Jersey-based organizer helping to build the movement for a just and democratic Philippines. Welcome, Mac.
Hi, all. Thanks, Sadie. Thank you, Professor Danny, for that great intro and 101. Yeah, very thankful to be here. Very thankful to see the final report coming out of the IOM and all the work that so many people have put into it. I had the privilege of being part of the Mindanao contingent in the first half of May and got to witness Election Day in Marawi City, which was a very intense experience, a very militarized experience for sure. But what I'm really here to talk about is the level of repression that people on the IOM faced, and something that I faced as well. And so when we were touching down into Mindanao and getting ourselves set up to start conducting our investigation, we actually got word from the national management team that I was red tagged back in Quezon City, where we were doing our orientation and initially meeting with the national management team. And so when various people in the national management team were walking around UP, they actually saw posters calling me a terror supporter. They used my passport photo. They put my full government name of my first, middle, and last name. And so it's very evident that the Duterte regime and now the Marcos Duterte tandem are like actively trying to repress any kind of observation of this election and really hinder any kind of open and democratic processes that the international community is being asked to oversee. And so we really want to highlight the repression that is developing of not just the people's movement, but anyone who even wants to observe the processes that are happening in the Philippines and even support the people's movement in really any way possible. And so we really want to recognize this as a new development in the repression of the people's movement and anyone that criticizes the current regimes in power and the consolidation of the fascists that are now in power. And so, we're seeing this as we saw multiple other IOM participants earlier in the year get red tagged as well. We're seeing this after we just saw Tinang 97 and 83 get detained, and also people overseas, even in the US, ND organizers in the US and their Filipino communities are getting red tagged as well. The government is using the consulates as bases to spread around terror tagging and misinformation of people's organizations. And so as the fascists are consolidating power in the Philippines, we really have to understand that this is a new development in repression against the people's movement and anyone who even dares to observe the election and try and encourage a more fair and democratic process. And so when we found out that red tagging was happening, the group that I was with in Mindanao, we were certainly very scared as to what that could entail and what that would mean for the remaining of our trip, because it happened in the very beginning. But our host assured us that we were safe and that they would protect us. And so we continued on with the IOM and our investigation, and were able to contribute to the Mindanao contingent of the report. And I'm very thankful for that. But we, really have to understand that this is a new development in the repression after years of this building up, and after the consolidation of power that is really hurting the people and is attacking the people's movement that's fighting for nothing but democracy and justice in the Philippines. And so it's really important to iterate that even the minimum observation of the elections in the Philippines is something that the government is not interested in people pursuing. And so when we're really looking at the IOM, understand that this was even a struggle to conduct in the first place because of how much the government does not want transparency to happen at the international level. And so don't have much to say besides that, but I think really want to highlight that we're in an era in which repression is rapidly developing, and the international community really needs to be monitoring that and fighting against that in solidarity with the Filipino people. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mac, for sharing your experience and highlighting the continued need for international solidarity and the rampant red tagging that is happening even on an international level. Our third speaker this morning is Reverend Michael Yoshi, recently retired after spending 32 years serving as the pastor of Buena Vista United Methodist Church in Alameda, California. Known for his leadership and activism, Michael has long been a progressive ecumenical voice in a range of social causes. Internationally, his work entailed partnering with the Palestinian village of Wadi Fukin, as well as advocating for human rights in the Philippines, where he has been active on the board of ICHRP and served as a commissioner for the International Observers Mission. Michael will be speaking on some of the results that were coming out of our final report. Welcome, Reverend Michael.
Thank you, Sadie. And I want to thank Professor Danny for his great summary and presentation, and also to Mac and all of the volunteers, the numerous volunteers internationally who are on the ground in the Philippines, and kind of underscore what Mac is saying about the increased acceleration of repression, intimidation, and violence against not only you as the volunteers, but the ongoing repression against people on the ground, activists there in the Philippines. And so we put that into context for today. I've been asked to highlight some of the failures of the election process on behalf of the IOM. So I'm going to quickly go down a list of items that will highlight that. It can be found in the full report that you all have access to. So number one was, of course, and some of these things Danny has already alluded to. Number one is the historically high failure rate of the electronic voting system. The widespread failure of the voting count machines has been documented by monitors, as well as issues around electricity failures and long delays for voters made voting very difficult for many. Number two, the large numbers of voters who did not get to cast their vote. Many found their names were not on the voter rolls or had to trust that where machines were not working. Election officials would later put their marked ballot paper to a voting counting machine, undermining the secrecy of the vote and transparency of the process. Number three, the higher levels of vote buying are really documented in the final report. Example is one of the IOM members in the Eastern Visayas witness bills in denomination of 50 to 1,000 pesos circulating with candidates' names written on them. And vote buying rates range from 300 to 4,000 pesos per candidate. In some areas, votes were purchased multiple times. And then, as Mac has alluded to at number four, red tagging of candidates and parties, as well as the IOM volunteers. Military and state officials openly campaigned against the opposition, red tagging Robredo's campaign, as well as candidates for the Senate and party list groups. And we have many stories in the report that talk about the red tagging and terror tagging that took place during the process. Number five, numerous incidents of deadly violence that plagued the campaign. The IOM has reported election-related violations of human rights, since mid-January in the form of political killings, shootings, abductions, death threats, political arrests, harassment, and surveillance of candidates and supporters. The full report has many stories that were collected during the process of monitoring. Number 6, an explosion of fake news around the election, which Danny has documented for us as well in his presentation, as well as the media manipulation and repression, harassment of journalists as well by the Marcos campaign. And then number 7, it's really important for us to understand the election took place in the most repressive context seen since the time of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Throughout the election campaign, the Duterte government continued its orchestrated campaign of state terror, marshaling the entire machinery of government, including the judiciary, the military, police, government departments of education, social services, and local governments in its war on dissent. The IOM observed soldiers in eastern Visayas up to the election day, intimidating people not to vote for Bayan Muna or other progressive party lists. I want to close with highlighting some of the recommendations that the report provides around the voting process. One, that the military must be excluded from all aspects of the electoral process. Military officials should not make public statements in support of or in opposition to any candidates or parties running in the election. Any officials who do so should be properly sanctioned by the COMELEC. That there should be addressing the issue of vote buying, since has been so rampant and it is illegal. Vote buyers must be apprehended and sanctioned to minimize or eliminate this practice. There has to be attention given to the electronic voting system, as it is not transparent, and as Professor Danny alluded to, the connections in terms of the corporate structure and partnership that's going on there. And then finally, social media platforms should be legally required to ensure that pages and accounts of users providing election-related content provide verifiable author profiles and content information, original or shared, and their sources, and set up mechanisms that encourage people to scrutinize the material's content and source first before being shared. There are many other recommendations that I think Chris will go into, but just I'll conclude there. And then just with this word, that we know that this election was the context in which prior repression and intimidation and violence against people in the Philippines on the ground continued, and then it will continue on past this election as well. So more so our need to be vigilant and continue to work together internationally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Michael, for that comprehensive overview. I'd like to now turn to Reverend Dr. Christopher Ferguson, a Canadian pastor, theologian, and social justice advocate from the United Church of Canada. He served as a General Secretary of the World Communion of Reformed Churches from August 2014 through August 2021. Chris has a long commitment to social justice, economic justice, and peace building across the globe, and has been involved in Philippine human rights issues since before the founding of iChurch in 2013. Welcome, Reverend Dr. Chris.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think I want to join all those that are recognizing the important work that has been done by those international election monitors and the Filipino organizations and people that at their considerable risk to themselves and their freedoms have tried to assure that the rights of the Filipino people were respected in this election. Despite all that effort and sacrifice, it's clear that that did not happen, and I want to focus in the minutes that I have on the way forward, and continually remembering the very, very high stakes, remembering that in the over 30,000, well over 30,000 people killed by extrajudicial assassinations in the time of the persecution of the so-called war against drugs and so on. The recommendation, basically the actions that are necessary and the recommendations that complement those that Professor Danny has talked about coming out, point to the need to mobilize the international community and governments around the world, UN and other international institutions around, first of all, actions and imperatives that are related specifically to the election, the seriously flawed and unjust electoral system. Depth in the question and answer about a system that is flawed and broken, that has been captured and is put at the service of maintaining the current elitist regime. The second are actions that continue to seek justice and accountability for the gross and systemic human rights violations of the Duterte administration. In other words, holding past actions to account in this present regime, continuing the necessary investigations by the International Criminal Court, the UN Human Rights Council, and others, and activating laws in countries that have such laws that allow actions to be taken to hold Duterte and his administration to account. The third block of recommendations go to actions that have to do with stopping the ongoing killings and human rights violations, red tagging, and so on now to restore the rule of law to the Philippines today and to ensure respect for human rights in the present tense. And the fourth is really mobilization around actions to support the Filipino people in the rights to self-determination and social transformation. In other words, to press against not only those things related to the electoral system and human rights violations as such, but to the entire oppressive economic and social system that means that people are not free to choose their own path as a society. I had earlier spoken in the press release of this being an exercise in paramilitary democracy, in quotes, fused with a system of semi-feudal dynastic rule. It's important to understand, therefore, that specific actions have to be taken within the human rights framework, and other actions have to be taken to make visible the actual nature of what's going on in the Philippines, and to have the international community not be party to an idea that this is business as usual or in any way a legitimate government. So again, these elections were not free, fair, or honest, and there is an imperative to stand by the Filipino people in securing the freedom of those that are currently detained, in moving forward for Filipino voices for a just and fair society. So there's a call to all of us, international institutions, civil society, and the UN and other international systems to act. There is an attempt to cover up and give another narrative about the current reality. And so this is an exercise of sustained truth-telling that is necessary. So thank you, Reverend Sadie, and a special thanks to all those who have worked so hard to bring the truth to the light. The sad news is there's still very much to do.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Chris, for that overview. We're going to turn now to a time of question and answering. I'm super grateful to Mac and Professor Danny, who have been super on top of answering some of the questions in our Q&A lineup, but so that everybody can benefit and maybe other panelists can also answer, we're going to revisit some of those. So I'm going to read some of those, and then if you want to just answer out loud so that everyone can benefit from the questions and the insight that you all have. So one of the first questions we have is for Mac. Mac, could you discuss in the ways the process in Marawi City might have been different from the processes in Manila and other provinces?
Yeah, and so I think, and what I wrote down as well is the levels of militarization were so extreme. I know, I believe there's a statistic that about 30% of the AFP is in the province, and it was very evident. When we were in Marawi, there was checkpoints throughout the city when we were driving about every 5 minutes even, and they were labeled as Comelec checkpoints. The day of the elections, we witnessed tanks at election sites, which were often schools and churches. We saw signs that indicated 4 p.m. curfews. And so I think the most notable difference, and when we compared with the other groups that were based in NCR and other provinces, was the level of militarization. It was truly very extreme, and I really cannot even begin to understate how much the level of military was, both PMP and AFP presence, in which both the PMP and the AFP were very evidently militarized, which I know is not the particular intended nature of the PMP, but is definitely how they presented themselves in Marawi and Mindanao as a whole. And so really noting the most significant difference in Mindanao, when we were conducting our investigation, was just how much military presence there was, and how much that inherently affects the democratic processes of this election when there's threatening military with semi-automatics at every corner, at every checkpoint, every election site. And so it was extreme, to say the least.
Thank you, Mac. I don't know, Professor Danny, or if anyone else has anything to add to Mac's observation of the militarization of those sites in Mindanao.
Just to provide a more general context, the reality in the provinces is that a lot of areas are really heavily militarized, particularly areas in Mindanao as well as in the Visayas region. Here in Manila, where I'm staying right now, we don't feel that much military presence, even if police presence is very much visible. Now, the irony here is that the military is supposed to be non-partisan during the election season. They're not supposed to take sides because they're there to support the police in preserving peace and order. But from our experience, as mentioned by Mac, they are the primary, sources of red tagging, of harassment and intimidation, and we have also anecdotal evidence pointing to certain political families and big businesses using the military as their own private army. Now, the other angle that we also need to look at is the existence of paramilitary forces. So these are not technically connected to the armed forces of the Philippines, but these are, de facto deputized by the government. They're given arms, they're given training, but they are civilians, and they are usually mobilized as private armies of the political dynasty. So herein lies the problem with militarization in the country, because instead of providing the necessary peace and order, they are the ones doing the human rights violations. So that's the sad reality, not just in Marawi, but also in other areas in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Danny, for that additional context. We have a question that was submitted online that when people registered. So I want to read that for our panelists now. So anybody's welcome to answer this as you see able. What do election observations mean for the solidarity work needed for those of us living in other parts of the world? What do we need to be paying attention to in the shift from a Duterte to Marcos regime? Will there be different forms of oppression, different emphasis?
Okay, maybe I should start, and then our other colleagues would just weigh in. Our recommendation is to pay special attention to two aspects of this information. One is historical denialism, because we're seeing the institutionalization and systematization of outright denial of facts. I do understand in other parts of the world, you have a problem with conspiracy theory, particularly the flat earth movement. Here in the country, it's something like the flat earth movement, because, the narrative of the glory days during, the dark days of martial law, it's still very much in the mindset of people. not because they're gullible, not because they're stupid, but because fake news has become so much entrenched in the public sphere that people easily fall for fake news given the technological sophistication in manufacturing all of these lies. So there's that problem that needs to be paid close attention to. But of course, the more fundamental problem of the domination of the rich and powerful in the country. So we don't want what's happening in the Philippines to happen in other parts of the world where disinformation will become normal, where certain candidates who are clear tax evaders, who have, whose reputation has been very questionable in the past, to be suddenly deodorized and, seen as the savior of that particular country. We don't want that to happen again. And of course, the continuity, the implication of a Marcos victory, it is not just confined to the 6-year term limit of the president from 2022 to 2028. Remember that the vice president is a Duterte. Most likely, she will run for president in 2028, or the Marcoses will decide, okay, one of our relatives, one of the members of the dynasty will continue the Marcos presidency, and then it will be tyranny and impunity beyond 6 years. Remember that martial law happened from 1972 to 1986. We don't want 14 years of darkness in the country. So the international community can help by helping amplify the reality in the Philippines. It will help us, and I'm sure that it will help other countries so that you can see certain lessons that you can use to ensure that the truth will be upheld in your respective part of the world. Thank you.
Sadie, I'd like to share a comment.
Right,
If I could.
thanks.
Yeah, I think, the question is a really good one, because I think it's asking the question about the connections between the election in the Philippines and what's going on in different countries. And so I think it's important for us to follow trends that are taking place. So for example, in Israel, where there's been an acceleration of violence, militarization against the Palestinian people, there's been a coalition government there, and then there's now a call for new elections there, which are not necessarily going to change the equation of what's happening with the militarization and occupation and the increased violence and killing of Palestinian people there. So we see these kinds of trends, and what is that connection internationally to the Philippines, for example? Then here in the US, for those of us who are in the US, we're in this sort of ironic stage right now where we're having these public hearings around the January 6th insurrection. And we see also this trend of disinformation that's taking place around our own elections in the US. And I think the question mark is going to be, what is the relationship between the new Marcos Duterte administration and the Biden administration? And the report does cover some of these issues where US representatives congratulated Marcos and Duterte, as well as the South Korean government, the Japanese government. And we have to look at the geopolitics of the Asian region as well, and Duterte Marcos' relationship with China, as we see them kind of reaching out to China to have a relationship there. And I think all of these things circle back as well as we talk about the terror tagging and the red tagging, seeing the Philippines as a US base for its anti-terrorism work, and the way that the US support has allowed the Philippine paramilitary and political forces to both not only terror tag activists and red tag activists, but commit the extrajudicial killings that have been going on for some years since the Philippines became a partner in the US anti-terror work. And I think this is a political issue that should be part of elections. How are people defining terrorism? How are people naming who are the terrorists? And what are the ways in which information and understanding of what's going on with this whole phenomenon of anti-terrorism around the world can be reshaped and rediscussed. I think it's a really important election issue for all different countries.
Thank you, Reverend Michael, for that important additional note. As perhaps a follow-up or continuation of this question, I think it's important to ask what else can be done, since there is so much evidence that this election was tainted, but it appears that on the 30th of this month, in just a few days, Marcos will be inaugurated and the new administration will take over. We know the Supreme Court is currently packed with Duterte's appointees. Congress is dominated by incumbent supporters. So what can be done to challenge the results of this election?
Yes, Reverend Sadie. I think if you look at the recommendations to our, one thing I say is to make visible the results of this report itself. But the important thing is in the recommendations from the Electoral Commission, is for the international community is I think to insist on the monitoring of the human rights situation, including the follow-up on the very human rights violations that were recorded during the election themselves, as well as the others. So I think that one thing is not to abandon the actual mechanisms that are already need to be further deepened around international investigations of the criminal court, and following up, as I say, in the Magnitsky style laws that allow actions to be taken. I think the questions is looking at these different spheres of influence in the EU, the European Commission, the Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court, is to really the issues that have already been raised by investigation PH, for instance, in terms of raising European mechanisms that could that could be used for political pressure in order to deal with monitoring political killings and unlawful detentions, and within the U.S. Congress and other methods. There is the understanding of U.S. Groups and citizens taking action to press the Congress for Philippines Human Rights Act, which would further inhibit U.S. funding for military and arming police and tie military aid more closely to U.S. Financial aid more closely to human rights violations. So in general, if you read the report, it's not to abandon the already form of action, but to deepen it so that in each country and in each international forum, we are already proposing very concrete actions, which among other things to contest the elections is using the human rights window to enter in and look at how the election itself was abusive of human rights and the specific mechanisms that exist now that need to be abolished and held accountable. So there's a lot of detail there, and I would recommend that people actually look carefully at the recommendations as applies to them in their own context. There are other more general recommendations included there too, like the part of helping the international community create an alternative or contest the alternative narrative that's being told about what's actually happening in the country. But there are concrete human rights related actions as well as political actions that I think we would really commend to people to undertake and bend into.
If I can piggyback, Sadie, if I can piggyback onto Chris. Chris alluded to the PHRA, which is the legislation being proposed by Susan Wild in Congress, and I want to just underscore that it's a very good organizing tool for folks here in the U.S. since this is a forum that's with Canadian and U.S. based folks. To not underestimate the power of using that as an organizing tool to educate people. This is where we turn around the disinformation campaign and really begin the truth telling in terms of organizing in local communities, organizing with different networks on that. And I think there probably are some people here who are working on that campaign. If you can put that into the chat box, some contact information So for people here who have not heard about PHRA, Susan Wiles' bill can begin to connect and network with folks here in the US in particular. And then I think for the Canadian folks, there have been some conversations about how there might be some parallel conversations around what activists are doing here in the US on PHRA with the Canadian Parliament as well. And then finally, what I want to say is that there are the list of the recommendations that the IOM report does make, but I think there are still things that are being analyzed, and we're hearing, today, for example, from Professor Danny, and things that are coming out of their group and other groups on the ground. I think it's very important for us to take their lead, follow what they are recommending for us in terms of building our solidarity together, both in Canada and in the US.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. It's so important to have the concrete next steps when we do this work and we come out with reports. We know that it can't stop there, that we have to continue our work and our concrete actions to continue to push for the stopping of human rights violations and calling for justice. Professor Danny has shared the slide presentation of Contradia. So I know there have been several requests for that. So please be sure to download that before this presentation ends. And then there was just a couple more questions. One question that maybe others are wondering about too is why not do a recount? How come that's not one of the calls? And Professor Danny, do you want to just explain why that's not one of the things we're asking for?
Yeah, actually, don't get me wrong. If people want a recount, okay, fine, you can do so. But as you can see from the empirical data, Marcos got 58% of total votes cast. For the first time in history, we have a Philippine president who won by a majority. In the past, presidents in the country only got a plurality of the votes. They did not get 50%. I think the closest was about 40 or so percent. So what does this mean in terms of the recount? I don't think the results would be substantially different from the results that we see now. And why do we say that? It's because the will of the people has been disrespected from the very start when you have an election system that lacks transparency and accountability. So the fundamental problem with our election system, and I think this should be also a lesson for countries that still adopt an automated election system, nothing is ever transparent in a situation where you use, among others, proprietary software, where you have a COMELEC that is controlled by the sitting president, and the quality of the appointments would leave much to be desired. Just for the record, the Commission on Elections in the country is supposed to be independent. It's not supposed to be, at the beck and call of the powers that be. But right now, there is a different texture to the Commission on Elections. It would appear that the ones pulling the strings would be those sitting in the executive branch of the government. So it's that combination. So you have a problem with the automated election system, and you also have the problem with the quality of the appointments, the questionable contracts and all that, and couple that with the massive disinformation, particularly historical denialism perpetrated by the Marcoses. So that kind of deadly combination has resulted in that kind of a result. So going back to the recount, I'm not saying it's not important. We're not saying that we should disregard it, but we would rather focus on the more fundamental issue, which is the lack of transparency in the election system. I think Chris also has a point. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think the point is in terms of a very clear, coherent, so one is the political reality about what's accomplishable, but the other is because our fundamental findings go to a flawed system that is militarily manipulated and controlled, To call for that system to simply revise the number of ticks on the ballot page misfocuses what our fundamental critique is. I think that's the point, to put it more bluntly. Our critique is that there has been a reign of terror that has made it impossible for people to exercise their freedoms before, during, and after the elections. In such a context, the box ticking and the ballot putting is simply a formality and will be manipulated. But that's not the worst part of this election. The worst part of this election is the systemic oppression that has created a militarized, politically dominated system that means that the whole exercise of the elections is an exercise of confirmation of the existing power relationships. The system doesn't permit anything else and is kept in place militarily. And this is Mac's testimony and others about the military presence. In such a reality, just to go back and look at the number of ballots doesn't matter. How about the people that have been intimidated? How about the people who are in jail? How about the people who have lost loved ones, the 60,000 people who have been killed, who are scared witless of the force of the police and the military? So with all those things, I think the systemic critique has to go through and systemic change has to be called for. And so, yes, any of these actions are okay, but I think generally, frankly put, a recount doesn't go deep enough to what the problem is.
Thank you both for that comprehensive answer. We're going to take one more question. I see one of our participants, Jose, had their hand up, so I want to call on them, and our tech person can unmute you if you still have a question that you'd like to ask.
Okay. Yes. All the points discussed here are very, very interesting. And these are all identifications of the problem, which is good enough. Somebody says that if you know what the problem is, you know the solution. I say this because back there in the Philippines, there is a movement like Bunyog. I think you have heard about that. They have already raised all these questions that had been discussed here, like election fraud. This was already put on formal petitions with the Supreme Court. Everything, the fraud, everything that was discussed here. And then there is already a petition being lodged with the Supreme Court addressing all these issues. Now, they only need 2 million votes, which could easily be raised by our advocacies, because I suddenly realized that out there in the Constitution is a provision that says people's initiative. It is actually, it seems to me, in my own understanding, that this is an initiative that is reserved for the rights of the people to raise issues, even make legislations on their own. But the process is 2 million votes for the Supreme Court to hear it. Now, if the Supreme Court is still controlled by the government, then we can always go out on the streets in the same number of the first people power revolution. But this one will be even more powerful because we are backed by provisions of the Constitution. We are going out there because we are demanding that all these things that we would ask, every recount and everything, should be heard and decided by the Supreme Court. If they don't do that, then we have justifications to go out in the street. So I speak here because I wanted to launch my own advocacy. I don't know who those organizers were, but they are on the right track. Constitutional means. We can go out there and share numbers, but the regime would just shoot and kill, murder our people. But if we do it under constitutional laws that we can assert and get support from, I think that also in short, let us be on the watch out for this petition to be circulated here in America, because I believe that our advocacies can raise easily 2 million signature votes, because that is everything that they're asking for, to be able to control and initiate and institute a good governance. Thank you so much for the time you afforded me.
Thank you, Jose, for that comment. I think we're going to wrap up our time together this morning. I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us this morning. Thank you for your time and your expertise. I also want to acknowledge all of our IOM commissioners and all of the work that they have committed to supporting a free and fair election in the Philippines. Sharon Burrow, Canon Barry Naylor, Severin de Lave, I can't say that name, I apologize. Lee Rhiannon. Yeah, Doug, do you want to say it for me?
Severine de Lavallée.
Yeah, I don't know French. I'm American.
Okay. Sorry.
Lee Rhiannon, Reverend Michael Yoshi, Reverend Dr. Chris Ferguson, and Xavier Romero. We are indebted to you for your work and for being willing to be part of this process. We're also very indebted to everyone who was an IOM participant and to our hosts on the ground in the Philippines. It's a tremendous amount of work to put this kind of effort together, for those who put the reports together. Everybody, we are super grateful. And this is just the beginning. This is the launch of the report, but this is not the end of our work. So we thank you for being here this morning. We have much work ahead of us to continue to hold the human rights violations that we saw present during the election, after the election, in the upcoming, what I'm sure will continue to be more repression. So we want to thank you for being here. Look for more ways to get involved. And as Reverend Michael and Reverend Dr. Chris illuminated, there are many ways to be involved and to continue this work of international solidarity. And it's perhaps more important now than ever as repression in our own countries continues to rise. And that has a direct impact on the repression that is happening around the globe. So we thank you for being here, and we look forward to continuing in the struggle with all of you in the days and weeks and months and years to come. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thanks. Thanks, Sadie.